Hello everyone, this is Professor Peony Army here, Chief Information Officer of Clan Oni, and while my title makes a very bold statement, I intend to back it up partially with theory, partially with fact. So let's begin. Right off the top, I want to have a conversation about scrims. Now, to make sure that everyone's on the same page here, a scrim is a practice game between two pro-level teams of any pro game in which they practice strategies, setups, particular ideas, whatever. They test things out in scrims. These are typically private games, so random people aren't involved, and in most games, they typically aren't released to the public. I'm going to get to that subject a little bit later. But that's what scrims basically are. For Call of Duty Modern Warfare, scrims take place in private matches, each pro team facing off against each other with CDL rules, with the CDL matches on CDL-used maps, one against the other, private match, nothing, no stakes, just for practice. That's their scrims. Now, originally, when this game was first released, there were no dedicated servers for private matches, which meant that private matches were sharing servers with public matches, and public matches typically get priority over private matches because there's more people involved in most cases. Private matches don't usually run 10 people. Usually it's a couple of people, depending on, your group, but generally speaking, the public matches get priority. So, this meant that the connection for private matches was typically bad, if not outright terrible. Although sometimes it could be good, more often than not it wasn't. Because, of course, it was getting lower priority. So, to compensate, what the pros really had to do was not necessarily find their best gun in the game or the best gun in the game, since neither was important. They needed to find a gun that was controllable enough and shot fast enough to be able to overcome the lag they were more consistently experiencing while scrimming. The M4A1 and the MP5 came up as the winners of this particular series of tests, apparently because that's all they use today and at the time. Now, in May and June, we got dedicated servers for private matches, which means better connection for private matches if you so choose. Now, this theoretically would have meant that pro teams should have been able to expand out with different guns and be able to play at least differently, but they didn't, even though they had a better connection. Now, probably the reason why is a combination of two reasons. First off, the pros were already so used to using the M4A1 and the MP5 that they really didn't want to just switch off to a different gun or try out new things, whatever. Secondly, the ping probably wasn't 100% consistent enough to be able to allow for a gun with lower firing rate or a lower recoil control to really be effective consistently. Sure, maybe you'd have a really great scrim where everyone had a great connection, or maybe your scrim against a particular team was really good because you're both teams live close enough to the dedicated server that there isn't really that bad of a lag, or if any lag at all. But then you're going to face or scrim off against some kind of a team that lives farther away, or enough of their players live farther away from that dedicated server where now you're starting to see lag problems. So it's probably a combination of just familiarity and having still inconsistent ping to be able to consistently use different weapons. Now, why is this a problem? Why does it matter that all the pros are using the same two guns? Well, frankly, it's not that exciting to watch, because once you're past the halfway point of a match, generally speaking, you know who's going to win, and it's not because one particular team is maybe super better than the other one, although that does happen. The thing is that since everyone's using the same gun, they're pretty much all on an even footing, and no pro can really effectively stand out. No one's out there doing something crazy and cool. Consider, for example, CSGO. Now, the first thing I'm going to do is hit you with the viewership numbers of the two most recent tournaments for these games so you can really understand the level of difference between interest in the pro level of both of these games. The most recent Call of Duty League that concluded had an average viewership of 35 to 45,000 people, unless the Huntsmen were playing, at which point that viewership changed from 75,000 to 85,000 people. Compare that to the most recent CSGO tournament that completed, which had an average viewership minimum of 150,000, and it peaked at over 300,000. Why? Well, the first reason is, of course, that CSGO is an 8-year-old game and has a long-standing audience. It has a consistent fan base, it hasn't changed a whole lot, which has pros and cons, but we're not going to get into those here. But more importantly is the actual structure of a CSGO match. Unlike Call of Duty, where the players just spawn in with their loadouts, and currently all loadouts are one of two loadouts, there's no real difference in loadout between players, maybe one or two different perks, that's about it. Here in CSGO, because of the economy system, the best weapons aren't necessarily what you want in a given round, or maybe not even what your team needs. Because the more effective a gun tends to be, the more expensive it is, and the less money you get from kills with it. So some players will opt to buy a cheaper gun in the hopes of shooting somebody and getting more money than they would have with a stronger gun. And it becomes this whole strategy of when do you buy the powerful guns and start using those? When do you want to pick up an enemy's gun and try to pick up some free cash by killing some people with that? When do you retreat and throw away your weapons so that way the enemy can't find your AK-47 or your AWP and use that against you in the next round? You know, there's a whole other level of strategy here beyond just the usual move, flank, shoot, you know, etc. There's the level of strategy that Call of Duty has, which is all about that movement, positioning, and being able to accurately put bullets on target and killing your opponent before they kill you and taking that objective. There's also an economy level of strategy. So there's basically two layers of strategy involved in CSGO, and they intersect very nicely just through the gameplay of how CSGO works. So that really keeps CSGO really fresh, because you're not necessarily always going to see the same guns, except in the final rounds, which tend to play out usually the same, but there are some exceptions. For example, Brolin using the SG-558, or the Krieg, as it is also called, he uses that gun fairly commonly, and really stands out when he uses that, because it gives him different angles of attack than maybe the AK-47 with worse vision would. Even though the AK-47 is technically stronger, the SG-558 has a scope which allows better longer range accuracy than the AK can put out, if you're good with it. And so Roland really stands out as a player, and I'm going to take another old example of Shroud, who used the AUG in a very similar way back in the day. And when Shroud retired, that was felt throughout the league, throughout the spectators, the fans of CSGO, all felt when Shroud left. It left a mark on the Pro League for a little while there for CSGO. And, well, not the Pro League, but the Pro scene. I'm so used to calling things Pro League these days that I forgot that there wasn't a league back then. It was just the Pro, you know, level. Well, there wasn't an official league back then, really. Anyways, back to the point, because I'm meandering. Shroud really stood out not only as a good player, but for someone who used different guns than what was normal, and he used them really well, and won a lot of games with those guns. And that was always a surprise. It was always a welcome surprise to see something really new and fresh be used. So, CSGO has an inherent tendency to be more fresh than what Call of Duty is currently allowing for. And to also emphasize this particular point, I want to talk about a completely different genre of game, the Multiplayer Online Battle Arena, or MOBA. Currently, most people are going to think of League of Legends, Dota 2, or possibly Smite, which is the one that I play, and I'm going to use Smite as an example. Now, leaving aside bug issues and balancing issues in these games, which happens to all of them, whenever a pro game happens, the pros pick their first couple of characters, each team picks their couple of characters, and then they start banning people. In Smite, neither side can use a banned character, but in other MOBAs, maybe only the enemy team cannot use them. And there's also the potential play of picking a character that your team or the team in question knows is good. For example, say, oh, we know this particular player is really good with this particular character, so we need to pick this character to keep that character away from that pro. It happens. If they can't potentially get the ban in time, or they're afraid of not getting the ban in time, or alternatively, they want to ban some other major threat that some other player is really good with. There's a whole level of strategy in just the pick ban phase alone for each MOBA, and it's very individual to the matchup, which is really cool to see. It's not... There are a couple of picks and bans that you're gonna see fairly standard based upon the state of the game at the time. Oh, this particular character is really strong right now, so each team is vying for that character or banning them. Some of these, you know, are inevitable, but about half of the pick and bans, at the very least, are very targeted towards a particular player or a particular play style. And that's based upon the matchup, where the team recognizes we have a problem fighting against this playstyle, we need to ban a character that really helps that playstyle, or this character particularly is effective against our playstyle or counters our playstyle, so we need to ban this person out rather than worrying about them being able to put their preferred playstyle forward. It's a whole conversation that you can have on the pick ban system for a MOBA. Beyond that, there's also the fairly interesting potential of taking a character that's designed for a specific role in game and putting it somewhere else. I don't think anyone who was a Smite fan in 2017 will ever forget when Deathwalker brought Ares to the solo lane in the summer finals of 2017. That was huge. No one saw it coming. It totally threw off the enemy team's pick bans in a huge way, and no one expected it to work until the first minute of the game, where Deathwalker just absolutely dominated the solo lane with Ares. If you don't play Smite or MOBAs, you probably don't understand what I'm talking about, but the fact that I can talk about this just from memory indicates how much this was a huge moment for the game, for the pro level, and how much it made Deathwalker, or Ares Walker as he became known afterwards, or at least bringing Ares into the solo lane became known as Ares Walker, but it really established him as a character in the pro scene rather than just a pro. It really put forth something that people could sit down, recall, and be like, I remember that, that was awesome. These moments don't exist in Call of Duty at the pro level right now as it currently stands, and that's why that's really hurting. I mean, to compare League of Legends as the most popular of the MOBAs, had even more of a viewership than CSGO. It had like 400,000 odd people at its peak, and at least 200,000 on average, and that's just, you know, huge for its most recent tournament. So you can really see where the dynamic changes based on matchups, based on the state of the game. Each MOBA changes up their, you know, main map every so often, which means every season, well, not every season, well, every season does feel different, but a season really stands out if it's a new map and no one's played on it before on the pro level, and it's extra exciting then. And Call of Duty maps, when a new map is released, maybe it doesn't even hit the pro scene, maybe no one plays it, maybe it's terrible because it's just badly designed, or maybe there's all potential kinds of things where a new map just doesn't make it to the CDL, or maybe it's just not that interesting of a map. I'll grant you that the more recent Call of Duty Modern Warfare maps have been more interesting in design than some of the previous ones, but does that necessarily mean they're played in the CDL? Well, maybe not. But that's not really, that's an example of another way in which Call of Duty is really struggling right now with its viewership. It's another example of a more diverse pro-level game. Now, I could go into Overwatch, where Overwatch was initially really popular, and then they created a league for it, and then they started doing weird things with the rules, and players started walking away. It's not really that huge of a deal. It's not really relevant to Call of Duty because the problems plaguing the pro Overwatch level aren't the same problems plaguing Call of Duty. Call of Duty pro level is really suffering from a lack of interesting events, diversity, and the ability to allow the pro players to really stand out. Whereas Overwatch is really having a problem with the sheer amount of time each pro has to take working and practicing on different characters It's to the point where it's just unfeasible, and they switch to a different game simply because it's easier to play and it keeps things more fresh. If you're an Overwatch fan or an Apex Legends fan, you may remember a couple of years ago when 1.5, 2 years ago, it's been a gradual process, but when Overwatch pros were switching over to Apex Legends. There are a couple of reasons for this, beyond the mentioned difficulty in practicing with the number of characters that these pros had to practice with. That was a problem, of course, and various rule changes and etc. Apex Legends has something Overwatch and even MOBAs or FPSs don't have, and that is called luck factor. And this is something really that you see when PUBG became popular. Why PUBG became popular. PUBG created the Battle Royale genre, essentially speaking. Yes, it pulled inspiration from other things, but PUBG was the first game to do it so well that it drew a huge audience. And part of the audience's draw to PUBG at the time was the fact that you drop onto this giant island with 100 other players, and you're foraging for randomly generated items, which meant that your skill was only half, roughly speaking, of the equation. The other half was your luck, which meant that high-level pro players from other games could switch over to PUBG, not even necessarily have to practice. All they have to do is turn on their stream, play some PUBG, and interest was there because it was really interesting watching these really skilled players try to overcome terrible luck. Maybe a player would be trapped between two teams with nothing but a shotgun and a dream. That's exciting. He's trapped in a building and there's 4 people converging on him, and all he's got is a shotgun, maybe a pistol, possibly a grenade, and maybe some bandages. Does he get out? Who knows? Stay tuned and find out. It's that formula, but without the commercials, and it's real. It's not pre-planned, it's not staged, it's live, and it's very real, and it's very exciting and interesting to watch, which is why Fortnite and Apex Legends also became very popular. Now, they're variations on the Battle Royale formula. Fortnite has the construction and is generally more child-friendly. Apex Legends is futuristic and involves special character-specific powers, which changes the dynamic. But both of these get really great viewership still, and there's not even necessarily a pro league for all of these. Yes, there's a pro league for PUBG, yes, there's a pro league for Fortnite, yes, there's now a pro league for Apex, but there wasn't originally, and there didn't need to be, and there still doesn't necessarily need to be for these games to be popular, or to, work on a professional, I use that term somewhat loosely here, level. They have a professional level, yes, but they didn't originally, and they were still pulling pros away from other games that actually had a dedicated pro scene. And that's why, is because of that dynamic of maybe your favorite player, as skilled as they are, fails because of bad luck, or maybe they pull off something really cool that's made even cooler because they did it against all odds. It's just higher stakes, and as a result, it's just much more interesting to watch. So there is that particular aspect to consider, and probably in terms of viewing, either be it from a casual or a pro level, that you can't get any better than a Battle Royale at this time. This is partially why Fall Guys is so popular. It's basically a non-violent technically non-violent Battle Royale where anything can happen, and even your favorite players who might be abnormally skilled suffer some hideous tragedy and fail, or they triumph against the odds, and it's just so glorious. That's how things really, that's how you grip viewers. That's the essential basic of viewership, of attracting viewers, is having something unpredictable yet exciting that you can always sit there and find interesting because you don't know what's going to happen. You can predict, generally speaking, how Call of Duty Pro level gameplay is going to happen. Really, it's just a matter of the team matchup and how good their communication is at the time. For example, right now we have the Huntsmen are really popular because they're huge. You've got the Dallas Empire right now, who are really skilled. They're really on a roll. You can expect one of these two teams to win a majority of the matches that they're going to go up against, and that's not interesting. But you put any one of those pros into Call of Duty Warzone, or even better, Apex, or PUBG, or Fortnite even, as much as I don't like Fortnite personally, and you've got a more interesting game. Now, why do I walk away from Warzone as an interesting game? Well, it's a little tough to explain, but Warzone, from a casual perspective, is terribly interesting to watch. You watch non-pro players like, say, Dr. Disrespect, whatever his current situation is streaming-wise, but he's not a pro player at the pro competitive level. He's a pro streamer who plays Warzone, and he plays whatever he feels like to. He's not going to necessarily play what is meta, because it is meta. He's going to play what he feels like playing, and he's going to be more interesting to watch because he's not just a pro streamer, he's a personality, he's a character. And that's more interesting to watch. No offense to the pros again, but the pros aren't characters, they're professionals who act professional. They play professionally, they communicate professionally. There's not, in most pros currently today from Call of Duty, there's not a whole lot of jokes or whatever going on. Like Clayster is a lot better about this. He's actually got a personality. He's got a stronger individual following than a lot of other the current generation of Call of Duty pros do, because he's out there, he's streaming, and he's got a vivid personality. He's fun to watch, and he's one of really the very few pro Call of Duty players that I actually can sit up and notice when he's mentioned in conversation, and I can't say that about a lot of the current Call of Duty pros, and I'm not saying that to be mean. I'm just pointing out that a lot of them aren't really standing out, and even Clayster is standing out not because necessarily he stands out during the pro gameplay, because he doesn't stand out in pro gameplay any more than anyone else. He stands out because he's been in the scene for a little while, and he's played other games, and he's, had something of a following before, and he's had, his personality, his character, his he's been out there. So that's as a comparison point here for those particular also type of pro gameplay. And that's really the problem with the Call of Duty League. It's just not gripping. And part of that, as I stated before, is inconsistent scrim connection, which hurts a lot. But part of it is just intrinsic in the whole way the multiplayer side of the Call of Duty League is set up. Now, it's interesting to note that the Call of Duty League has confirmed that pro teams will be narrowing down to 4 players. And while this is the former number of players on a pro team before, I don't necessarily think that it's just because it was the old way of doing things that they're switching back to the famed 4 people per pro team. It's fairly interesting to note that the average Warzone squad is 4 people. Coincidence? Well, not really. Quite frankly, Warzone attracts substantially more viewership than the multiplayer side because, again, of that much more interesting dynamic of can your favorite player, be it they a streamer or pro player, overcome these overwhelming odds of whatever they happen to be at the time to triumph. Maybe they pick up this horrific gun in the early game and they just can't find anything better for a while. They just can't find anybody to kill for the money to get something better for a little while, and now they're looking for an easy fight, or maybe they get jumped by a squad when they're by themselves trying to revive their squad. All kinds of random things can happen in the middle of a Warzone game that can't happen in a multiplayer game. And I just personally think that the Call of Duty League is going to slowly sway away from the multiplayer side of the league and start pushing more towards Warzone. since I would also like to point out that Warzone has been confirmed to be transferring through to the next Call of Duty. So the Warzone that you're playing today is going to be not exactly the same as the Warzone you'll be playing with Black Ops Cold War, but it's going to have the same basic setup. They're sharing a plot line, they're sharing at least some structures. You know, it's a continuation. There won't be a huge change there. The multiplayer side of it will be interesting to watch. I think that the multiplayer side of Call of Duty Modern Warfare is doomed. There's just not the viewership, there's not the interest. The way it's structured isn't interesting, and the pros aren't standing out because they either don't have the connection in scrims to stand out and try new things, or they just don't care to. There's just no real interest, there's no dynamic excitement present in Call of Duty Pro level multiplayer that is present in literally every other pro level game. So really that's what it comes down to, is just a lack of gripping excitement. And whether or not Black Ops Cold War fixes this, whether they save the multiplayer side of the pro Call of Duty, or they just give up on it wholesale and switch over to Warzone as a consistent pro level scene, remains to be seen. What really hurt this is the goal of this game was to draw in newer players. This has been officially stated by numerous people involved with creating Call of Duty Modern Warfare, and I don't have a particular problem with creating a game that caters more to newer players. The series, in terms of purchasing, in terms of sales, was slowly dying as well since Black Ops 2. Black Ops 2 was the previous big hit of Call of Duty, and since Call of Duty Black Ops 2, just purchasing had been going down and down and down until this one. And so they created this one specifically to pull in new players, make it a little bit easier to get into, and I appreciate that, because I'd fallen out of Call of Duty at Black Ops 2. I played Black Ops 2, mostly zombies, but I did play some multiplayer. And I saw the trailers, and I heard what my cousin said about Black Ops 3, and I was just like, nope, I'm not gonna buy this. And I said the same thing for a lot of the other ones that came, after Black Ops 2. That's fine. I got back into it with Modern Warfare because it looked cool, there was gun customization, which I love, and that, really pulled me in, and I love Call of Duty Modern Warfare, but its pro scene is boring. Now, can they do anything with it currently? Potentially. If they could make the private matches have way better connection, then possibly you would see the pros expanding out to using different guns, that aren't the M4A1 or the MP5, and this would at least allow them to stand out a little bit more. For example, Major Maniac about a month ago played a tournament, not a CDL tournament, but a tournament hosted by a different group. I can't remember who for the life of me off the top of my head, and I apologize for that, but he played a tournament, I think it was a tournament anyways, on stream, where anything went, he could use whatever gun he wanted. So what does he do? Well, Major Maniac immediately goes to the LMGs and decides he wants to use a Bruin, but if you paid attention during that particular stream, you will notice that he also had a PKM build, which means Major Maniac has a certain amount of fondness for LMGs that maybe a lot of other pro players don't necessarily have. Why does this matter? Well, if Major Maniac were able to have the connection to more consistently scrim with it, maybe Major Maniac could find himself more comfortable using the AK-47, trying it out a little bit in some scrims, seeing if he can rig up an AK-47 build that maybe he's more comfortable using than the M4A1. And now you're thinking, oh my goodness, but puny. The M4A1 and the MP5 are the best guns in the game. Well... Now, I hate to do this to you, but I have to bust out an Excel spreadsheet to really emphasize my point here. But we're going to talk about, ignore the rest of them for a second, we're going to talk about the M4A1. Now, at your best distance, your best optimal range of 30 meters, you're killing a target in 3 headshots or 4 torso shots. More likely than not, though, you're killing people in 4 or 5 headshots, or, let's be even more honest here, probably 5 to 6 torso shots, unless you're really close or you're so skilled with the M4A1, like at the pro level, where you're hitting headshots fairly consistently. but you're looking at an approximate 4 or 5 shots to kill somebody at most ranges with the M4A1. Okay, that's fine. Now we come over here to the AK-47. Don't be distracted by the other stats yet. The AK-47, for the most part, doesn't really care what range your target's at. 2 headshots, 3 chest shots, everywhere else 3 or 4, depending on, whether or not they're within 27.5 meters. That's fine. Now, does the AK-47 require a little bit more precision? Yes, and a lot of people are going to be like, well, that makes it a worse gun. Well, technically, but if you take the time to legitimately practice with the AK-47 and you predict the recoil because you know it so well, then a player with an AK-47 is going to beat a player with the M4A1. And how do I know this? The DPS numbers. See, the blue numbers up here are the rounds per second, which, when you multiply it by the damage per bullet at various ranges, you can predict how much damage you can put down range in any given second. The M4A1, in its most optimistic scenario, puts down 565 damage, well, actually rounded up 566, but anyways, it doesn't really make a difference when damage or not. It can kill 5 people in a second, in-game. Swell. The AK-47, at its optimal, can kill 7 people in a second. That's quite a difference, especially if you're playing something like Hardpoint, where people are just flying all over the place trying to get into that square. At its absolute worst, the AK can still take out 4 people at the longest distance, hitting the legs or the arms or whatever, whereas the M4, hitting anything that isn't the head, can only kill 2 people. With the exact same ammo count of 30 as a default clip size, the AK-47 puts out so much more damage in the same amount of time of 1 second that if you practice with the AK-47, you're going to be more effective than somebody utilizing the M4A1. Does that mean the M4A1 is useless? No, it does not. Nor am I saying the M4A1 is necessarily bad. Both guns have their pros and cons. Now, as I pointed out at the beginning of this particular sequence, the AK-47 has much more recoil than the M4A1 does, and it takes a certain amount of practice to become skilled enough with the AK-47 to so easily beat an M4A1 user. Barring, of course, the usual, oh, I shot you first, therefore I basically win. It's much easier to win first shots with the AK because by the time your opponent's generally aware of you, they're dead. It only takes 2 or 3 shots. There's not really much room for maneuvering there if you're getting shot at by an AK-47 user, whereas the M4 takes 4, maybe 5 shots. Maybe the opponent can turn around and get that sweet headshot that they need to save themselves, or maybe they just die. The point here is that there's more room for a victim of an M4A1 to counterattack you. The other 3 versions, which is the M4A1 with the 9mm ammo, the MP5, and the MP5 with the 10mm ammo, I mostly have for comparison purposes. The MP5 obviously has some problems with range. What's fairly interesting is that within the first 10 meters, it actually is stronger than the M4A1, but beyond that, it drops in effectiveness quite a lot. But quite frankly, in terms of damage, it's probably a little bit more consistent than the M4A1, just based on the numbers of the green damage per shot, not even factoring in rounds per second or damage output per second. Doesn't really make a difference. You notice that the MP5 at default basically stays the same. Damage-wise, it keeps up fairly well. It starts higher, but drops slightly lower, but not low enough where the average MP5 user should be concerned. It's not really that big of a deal. Again, though, the MP5 has slightly worse recoil than the M4A1, specifically in its side-to-side recoil, which is decently higher than the M4A1. I also wanted to throw this in here because I thought this is a fascinating fact, is that the 10mm ammo on the MP5 does not boost the damage of this gun, it simply boosts your damage range. And it doesn't really... yes, 41 plus is decent, but at that point, if you're concerned about range, why not use the M4A1? But I did also want to point out something of a pet peeve I've noticed on the pro M4A1 builds, in that they all extend the barrel of the gun. Now, as you can see here, that range doesn't make a huge difference. Maybe you're really fond of range, maybe you like playing the long game, that's fine. In that case, range, is fairly important, but at the pro level, where these guys are, really skilled with these guns, does the range make a huge difference here by 1 or 2 bullets? Not really. Take a hypothetical scenario of the M4A1 with the standard barrel versus, say, the extended barrel. So the extended barrel user will be able to kill you in, say, 5 shots at a longer range where you're going to take 6 shots. The catch here is that extending the barrel of the M4A1 means you're giving up ADS speed. What if that ADS speed that you're losing is what kills you? By taking off that longer barrel, you're aiming down sights faster, which means that you are putting bullets down range more accurately faster than someone with a longer barrel, and it just doesn't make sense to extend the barrel when you can use the standard barrel and put on a compensator, which, yes, also decreases ADS speed, but not by nearly as much as the extended barrel of the M4A1 does, and there are 2 different extended barrels, which is why I'm not being specific here. And it just does not make a whole lot of sense from that perspective. Yes, there's recoil control, but again, you practice with a gun enough, and you don't need recoil control. Recoil stabilization still probably you should use, but recoil control becomes less necessary as you become more experienced with a gun. It's just a matter of practice, it's a matter of becoming familiar with that recoil. I have a Kilo series I'm working on currently where I really demonstrate that the Kilo's recoil is really predictable. Most, if not all, of the guns in the game have extremely predictable recoil patterns that once you adjust to them, you just don't need recoil control anymore. It just isn't as necessary. So just whacking off the extended barrel, giving up some of that recoil control, giving up the comparatively useless range, just in the face of the kills, the shots per kill, and putting on a compensator gets you similar amounts of recoil control, slightly less recoil control, much faster ADS speed, and much better movement speed, which is fairly important. It just doesn't make sense to me to extend the barrel on the M4A1 unless, and this is the only time I am fine with this, unless the player really prefers how the iron sights feel on the extended barrel. I know a player who plays the M4A1 with iron sights but can't use it unless he's extended the barrel of the gun because the iron sights feel better to him, and I can respect that. That's a personal preference. I basically don't argue sights. Use whatever sight you want. Sights are the most personal thing, and nobody should tell you what sight you should or should not be using. They can make recommendations for specific magnifications, like, oh, you should try somewhere between 3 and 4 on this such and such a gun, but at that point, which sight you use between 3 and 4 that you actually play with is totally up to you. But beyond recommending magnification levels, sights are hugely personal and should not be recommended. I'm just not going to touch that. So from that perspective, if you are extending the barrel of your M4A1 because that's how you prefer the iron sights, that's fine, extend that barrel. But if you're using some kind of a sight on your M4A1, or you're not extending the barrel for sight comfort, don't extend the barrel. Range increases unless you're using a marksman or a sniper rifle generally don't matter. Or the FAL also cares, but that's not CDL legal anyways, so that doesn't really matter. The only other argument I would make would be trying to use the Odin as a marksman rifle, which I have played around with. It's one of my favorite ways of playing the Odin. Then range matters there as well, but if you're going to go full auto on a gun, range isn't that important. You're putting enough bullets down range fast enough where one bullet difference isn't important, especially if you aim down sights faster than your opponent does. In most situations, the person with the longer barrel loses, even though on a technical level they need one less bullet to kill you, but because their ADS speed is that fraction of a second less based on the RPS of all these guns, you're going to see them lose pretty consistently anyways. that's just how ADS compared to range is. Range isn't that important for full auto weapons, and at least give it a try if you're not doing it for comfort reasons. But this is all just to establish that another fact that I think is going on behind the scenes, but I can't personally guarantee, this is just a theory of mine, but nobody is sitting down and testing builds or suggesting builds to these pros, because if you watch a pro's stream and they're trying something new, they have no idea how to build it. And I personally believe, from a personal perspective, that each pro team should have somebody who sits down and theory crafts builds for each of their players. Like I mentioned earlier, Major Maniac, maybe you should try the AK-47, because maybe he would like it more than the M4A1 or the MP5, because it's closer to the LMGs he apparently prefers playing, because when he has the option, he uses them occasionally. I can't guarantee he uses them all the time in casual play, because I don't see 100% of his casual play. He plays off stream also. I mean, they all do. But from what I've seen, he at least has some preference for LMGs, so maybe the AK-47 would feel better to him than the M4A1. Again, if his scrims are of a stable enough connection to try this. Which, you know, back to the point of the longer barrel, if you're ADSing faster, then lag is less of a problem as well. Like that's decreased ADS speed just makes lag a little bit more egregious, a little bit harder to deal with. So I don't know why you would extend the barrel on those. It just doesn't make sense to me, personally. And if somebody could explain to me how one bullet difference somehow compensates for the increased ADS speed of having a shorter barrel, please let me know. I would love to debate this topic. But from personal experience, personal tests, and just from the numbers here, it's not a big enough bullet difference to really make it matter. Now, for something like the 9mm, absolutely, range would play a pretty serious difference here, because that's, as you see, pretty small differences in distance here, and that's why I set up the 9mm M4A1 for comparison. It puts out, technically, on average, more damage, but that damage falls off quite drastically when you start talking about hitting non-optimal spots at longer distances, and range would really make a difference for the 9mm version, and that makes a lot more sense. But for the standard ammo M4A1, increasing the barrel length does not help enough to lose that ADS speed that'll actually save your life, in all honesty. Same thing with the MP5, like the 10mm ammo. Does this range really matter? Maybe it does. It's, again, fairly substantial differences here in distance, especially as you go up. Like the close range, that's a 1 meter increase. Over here we've got a 3 meter difference between the max here and the max here, and then suddenly we're jumping to almost 20 meters of change, and it's like, wait a minute, hold up. It's a completely different gun at the longer ranges. So this is more of, if you're a longer range player and you don't like the way the MP5 plays standard, try the 10mm because it's much better at long range. But overall, it really depends on how close you get, and a lot of pros don't get far enough away to use that range, even if they were to use the 9mm. I wouldn't recommend the way the pros play currently, generally speaking. Obviously, there are exceptions to this rule that I'm not going to get into because that's not the point of this video, but most pros could probably do just fine with the 9mm M4A1 and leave the barrel standard and not have any kind of issue, or extend the barrel and go for that slightly longer gameplay depending on, again, how they play. But the 9mm ammo, yeah, extend that barrel. That actually matters here. That's, you know, that's a difference of 2 meters. Suddenly you're killing 2 bullets faster, maybe, just in the span of 2 meters. Can be important, but for standard ammo, for the AK-47, it's just not important. Like, at least for the M4A1, there's some small justification for it. Like, there is a 1 bullet difference here. AK-47, 90% of the time, unless you're, like, literally shooting their legs and arms all the time, a range difference doesn't matter for the AK-47. You never need to extend the barrel on the AK-47 unless you habitually shoot them in the arms or the legs. Just increase that recoil control, increase the recoil stabilization, don't put a sight on it, and focus on practicing those chest and head shots. Like, if you aim for the neck of an enemy, you're totally fine. Like, it'll just kick up into the head and kill them, no problem. It's a matter of practice, but I'm just here to argue that there's nobody behind the scenes telling each of these pro teams, hey look, you, Major Maniac as an example, you like LMGs, try this AK-47 build, maybe you like it, maybe you make a couple of changes on it, go on to public CDL matches, test it out, if you like it there, take it into your next couple of scrims, try it out there, see how you feel about it on a pro level, then maybe, you know, we have a conversation about it. That would help. The point of all this is to explain that if the pros either did try or could try, depending on what the connection is to the private dedicated server, different guns, it would be more interesting. They would stand out more for using different things, or maybe particularly unique combinations of attachments on a gun. They would be able to really, you know, personalize their look in game, even beyond the operator, but the guns that they use, since that's mostly what we see anyways. And it would, at the very least, have some really cool, serious conversations about a deeper level of strategy, of almost CSGO levels of strategy, removing the economy aspect of, okay, so going back to Major Maniac, who's become my favorite example here, and I'm sorry, Major Maniac, but you are interesting to me as a human being. Major Maniac using the AK-47, he can play longer distances because the AK doesn't really care, so now he's that mid to long range AR assault rifle wielding player, and now he's looking at maybe being more aggressive from a longer distance that the M4 can't really compete with, and now you've got maybe another player who prefers some SMG sneaking around the side, while Major Maniac is holding their attention with his AK and maybe popping some heads and doing some good work. It suddenly becomes a deeper level of strategy when everyone isn't using the same damn guns. That's what I'm trying to prove here. It was a little bit extended, and I apologize for that, but I needed to break out the Excel sheet. I needed to show you these numbers. I needed you to see and understand that there's nobody behind the scenes helping these pros with their builds. Yes, they're pros, but they're also building specifically to what they believe is the strongest, which, as I've just shown here, isn't necessarily true, and what they are using might be more swayed by potentially dealing with lag than anything else, which gets back to the main problem that the CDL needs to really be fixing here, which is the ping and the connections. And now, finally, onto the scrims that I mentioned at the beginning of the video, or at least the discussion on seeing the scrims and being permitted to view the scrims. This is the only game, personally, that I have seen, that I have enjoyed, where I've been permitted to just go onto the internet, find a team's scrims, and just watch them. Specifically, Dallas Empire, Clayster posts a lot of his team's scrims, and his organization lets him. I don't personally have a problem with that, but a lot of other organizations religiously guard their scrims because they really don't want the enemy teams to see how they think, to see what they're testing, you know, or the complete tests anyways, the communication, discussion on what they can change for the strategy. It's a whole thing. I mentioned the Deathwalker Ares solo earlier, the Ares Walker. That was such a surprise because in MOBAs especially, scrims are guarded pretty religiously, and just nobody is permitted to see those except for the players and the coaches, so that way they can finesse their strategies. And just the Ares Walker plan totally saved it. Well, it didn't save the game, it totally dominated that game from the first minute all the way to the end. It was a huge decision. It was such a surprise. The enemy was completely caught off guard, won that game hands down by itself. Just that one decision and the way they played it. It was a beautiful strategy, and they were able to pull it off in surprise because, as is standard in MOBAs, they guard their scrims, like I said, very closely. But that's not present here. Even CSGO guards its scrims relatively well. I personally haven't seen any CSGO scrims. I don't know if anyone else has, but I have not, as a regular viewer of anything. I've granted haven't seen much in the way of professional CSGO for a while, and I'm just getting back into that, but I personally haven't seen or accessed any scrims from any pro teams for CSGO, or for any other pro level game that I've personally watched. But that just goes really to emphasize how much it doesn't matter, or how little it matters that each team knows what the other is scrimming, because they all use the same guns, they all basically play the same strategy. It's just a matter of the players' individual skills and how well they work as a team. That's basically what it comes down to. And the team with the better players and or the better communication wins. It's not because they used a cool combination of guns, it's not because they used a cool new strategy. It just doesn't exist in the CDL scene at this time with the way the game is constructed. And even if the players got better servers with 60 FPS connection, since the average player right now gets 30 to 40, depending on your proximity to, you know, the dedicated private servers, 30 to 40 is okay, but it's not the 60 you want for an FPS, obviously. So that needs boosting, and the players need to be encouraged to, you know, think outside of the box more. The map designs maybe could do with some more diversity. I don't know. Is it even worth at this point trying to change it up? You know, we're a couple of months away from Black Ops Cold War coming out. Does it matter for Modern Warfare? Probably not. I doubt they're going to change Modern Warfare's pro scene. It'll be very interesting to see what they do with the pro scene of Black Ops Cold War, but as I stated earlier, Warzone is transferring over. Warzone looks like a long-term thing, and I think the CDL is going to eventually start putting more focus on professional Warzone rather than professional multiplayer, simply because, again, Battle Royales have that luck dynamic, there's more interest there, it's a much more interesting thing to watch in general, and I think that's really where they're going to start pushing the pro scene, the viewership and everything, is towards Warzone, and multiplayer is going to be still supported, but more as an afterthought than the main focus. But that's just what I'm seeing for the future of professional Call of Duty, at least from what I've seen and what I've, you know, looked into. And if you want to do your own research, I'll provide some links to get you started in the description. I'm not going to put all my, you know, links in there, because the links that I will have in there are going to connect to the other ones that I used. They're all very interconnected. I don't want to bloat my description. You can click on the link and follow that one to its sources, which I in turn also used, etc. So you can go down that rabbit hole if you really want, or if you want to debate it, or if you have questions, just, you know, hit me up, whatever. I'd love to debate it. Go for it. Thank you all very much for listening and or watching, and I hope you have a fantastic 24 hours.